Chapter 206 Ignoring the Knocks. Neil answered her with his mouth, parting her lips with his. He pulled off her hospital cap and shoved his fingers into the luxuriant mass of hair, and she crushed herself against him, answering his passion with the same wild, exquisitely provocative ardor that had haunted his dreams in Verdantia and awakened him in a sweat in prison. He dragged his mouth from hers. "Let's go back to the bed. The sofa is too small," he said in a thickened voice he hardly recognized as his own. She nodded eagerly, knowing exactly what he wanted them to do on the bed, and she led him straight where he wanted. But when they reached the bed, she looked guilty and embarrassedly towards the door. As if knowing what she meant, he smiled. "Nobody will walk in without my permission." She sank down onto the bed, her face turned up to his, eyes honest and searching. "Before we do anything else, can we lie down for a little while and talk first?" she asked, intending to clear up everything before they'd get busy doing something exciting. She wasn't worried about making love with him here because the room didn't look like a hospital room for a second, as it was meant for the VVIP patient with a large bed. But she'd like them to talk before anything else. Neil hesitated. On the one hand, he longed to put the past behind them and spend the present making love to her on this frilly, large bed, which seemed absurdly exciting when she was sitting on it staring up at him. On the other hand, she was clearly upset, and they couldn't very well begin again until the past was dealt with. For a little while, he agreed. She propped up a pile of pillows against the headboard for both of them and he stretched his arm out, curving it around her shoulders as soon as she moved next to him. When she cuddled close, her hand resting atop his chest, he remembered the mornings they'd spent in bed in the cabin, sitting exactly like this, and he smiled. "I forgot how perfectly you fit me. You're thinking about the mornings in the mountain cabin, aren't you?" It was a statement, not a question, and he tipped his head down and smiled. "I also forgot how perceptive you are." "Not perceptive, really. I was also thinking about the same thing." She smiled, and then made a hesitant attempt to open the dangerous discussion of their most recent past. "That night, I wanted to jump off the cliff," she began, "because I thought you believed the rumors online and that you've left me without hearing my own part. Everything about those videos are lies," he completed it for her. "I didn't believe them for a second. I'd be damned and absolutely crazy to think that woman was you." "Really?" She sighed in relief, but then frowned. "Then why didn't you contact me but let me believe I've been abandoned instead?" "Well, as much as this might sound stupid to you now, I didn't contact you because I thought it was the right thing to do at that time. I thought it was best I reach out to you after I've established the Galvera enterprise back to its original position to secure your safety and future." He admitted, realizing how stupid that idea was now and how he'd almost lost her because of it. "Why would you think I'd care if you are not as powerful as before?" she said, stunned. "I'd lost my affection for you because I was forced to believe you don't care about me enough to contact me." Neil stiffened. "You've lost your affection for me?" It hit Neil then that although he'd told her he loved her at the cliff, she had said only that she'd missed him. In a carefully expressionless voice, he added, "Somewhere I got the idea that you'd never stop loving me no matter how long it took for me to be away. Now that I think about it, that was purely a conclusion I drew from the image of you I remembered in the mountains when you were leaving," he said tightly, making a move to withdraw his arm from around her. "I think this discussion might be better held on the sofa or outside." "Neil Wayner," she said shakily, tightening her hand on his arm, "don't you dare leave this bed. If you ever shut me out again without an explanation, I'll never forgive you." His head fell back against the pillow and he wrapped his arms tightly around her, his voice heavy with irony and relief. "What is it about you that demolishes my mind? In the mountains, you made me feel like an emotional yo-yo, and it's happening again." Reverting to their original topic, he said, "I have made a lot of calls for the past 2 days you were unconscious, and the videos online about you have been brought down. I've hired many investigators to fish out the bastard who'd made those videos. However, they're still on it. And about those who humiliated you at the banquet." Mia shuddered in his arms at the mention of the birthday banquet. "I'm sorry," she whispered brokenly, turning her face to his chest. "I don't think I could ever get rid of that scene in the banquet. I shiver at the thought of the humiliation. I feel like the world's greatest coward." Neil registered her reaction and made a decision, but he withheld that for later. Instead, he tipped her chin up and said, "I will avenge you very soon, my love. None of them will go unpunished." He smoothly traced his hand up and down her spine to soothe her trauma while silently making his plans to hit back every single soul who'd witnessed her get humiliated without intervening or standing up for her at that banquet. Seeing how his mention of the banquet had ruined her mood, he searched desperately to lift her spirit again, and then he found a topic he knew she'd love to talk about without spoiling her mood. Pressing his hand on the little bump on her lower abdomen, he said, "Our baby seems to be growing faster than I thought. I can feel the bump already." He ran his hand around the bump, causing Mia to giggle delightedly in his arms. "Of course, it's growing. It's been almost 3 months now," she said, looking up and pressing a kiss to his tattooed chest. "Now that you are here, we will look forward to the day we'll welcome our baby to the world." She nibbled his nipple teasingly as she spoke, and Neil drew in a sharp breath as he warned, "Keep doing that, my love, and I promise you'll have to carry dozens of my babies as a punishment." With a laugh, she leaned her forearms against his chest, but her eyes were slumberous. "I'm terribly greedy, Neil. I don't mind that as a punishment. But for now I want to make love to you." Tensely and amusingly, Neil cupped her face between his hands, his thumbs rubbing over her cheeks. "Do you, darling, want to make love to me?" he asked, amused by how bold she was becoming. "Desperately. We'll do that all day and night if you're up for it." She bit her lip, her shoulders shaking with laughter as she made lazy circles on his chest. "I am more than up for it, but I don't know about you." He leaned down and sealed her lips to his as he whispered against her mouth, "I am. I have been up for it since the moment I bathed you naked in the tub," he said, enjoying the sexual banter and the exhilaration of the unique combination of laughter and love she'd always made him feel. There was a slight knock on the door, and they both ignored it. Neil's smile gradually faded as he lifted her chin and his gray eyes locked onto her brown ones. Never before had he imagined that a man could feel whole simply by having the woman he loved in his embrace. With her by his side, he no longer harbored any regrets over his past mistakes or decisions, as those very errors had led them to this moment together. Gazing into her eyes now and recalling her words of referring to herself as a coward, a memory from their childhood when he had gone to visit a classmate in the neighborhood flashed to his mind. Their neighborhood then had been a peaceful and secured one where children could walk around unsupervised by the adults. There were securities in every corner with surveillance cameras to monitor them. As he was leaving his classmate's estate, he'd witnessed a frightened Mia clutching a puppy to her chest, as the mother dog was about to attack her. If he had not arrived with his friend and the housekeeper in time, she would have been severely injured by the large dog. Despite expecting her to cry after the ordeal, Mia surprised him by running towards him with the puppy and flashing him the most innocent, beautiful smile he'd ever witnessed. "Here is the puppy I promised you," she laughed, but Neil was too worried and upset to pay attention to the gift. Instead, he sternly scolded her, grabbing her shoulders. "Are you crazy? How could you take a puppy away from its mother? You could have been hurt." She hadn't cried when the dog wanted to attack her, but she cried when he scolded her. He'd watched her brown eyes well up with tears, making him feel like a monster. Looking back on it now, he realized she'd always been brave. Returning back to the present, Neil caressed her cheeks as he said, "You are an angel, Mia. Do you have any idea how I feel every time I look at you?" he asked. She shook her head, and he said, "I feel loved. Incredibly, completely, unconditionally loved. Even when you thought I was a murderer, you still stood up for me." Lowering his mouth to hers, he whispered, "I have never known a woman who has as much courage as you." He kissed the corner of her eyes, dragging his lips across her cheeks to the corner of her mouth. "Or as much love to give." His hands slid under her gown and down to her underwear. "Give it to me, darling," he whispered, "all of it." Now, he opened her mouth with his, deepening the kiss, his hands moving over her bare skin, his tongue searching her mouth, diving slowly into it, and when she unbuttoned his trousers with shaky fingers and slipped her hands into it to touch his hardened erection, the moan of pleasure he heard was his. He got rid of her gown and was about to take off his trousers, when the knock they'd ignored at the door got louder. The pounding of his brain, he slowly realized, was the hammering at the door. Swearing and cursing the entire generation of whoever that was, Neil sat up, intending to continue to ignore the door so they could resume from where they'd stopped. He pulled Mia back to the bed as she'd got off and panicked to wear back her gown. She looked at the door guiltily, but he covered her mouth in a desperate kiss to distract her from the knocking. "Mr. Weiner, you have some visitors." Zephyr's voice accompanied the second round of hammering on the door. "Neil, I think we should stop now. You need to, she moaned in pleasure when he gave her breast a little squeeze and nibbled it. "I don't want to stop. Whoever the visitors are will get tired and come back tomorrow. I want to spend the whole day and night with you alone." He rolled her onto her back and rolled atop her while kissing and cuddling her breasts that were hardened and begging for his touch. However, the knock on the door became louder and more annoying with each passing second. "Mr. Wayner, the doctor is here to check on Miss Harrison. She demands an entrance," came Zephyr's voice again. Neil cursed under his breath in Spanish before he leaned his head against Mia's chest to control his rage. If it were up to him, he'd continue to ignore the people outside the door, but the woman in his arms was trying to slip away now that she was aware of the people outside. "Neil, we need to answer the door," she said, her panicked eyes flying to the door. "I need to use the restroom first," he said, raking his hands through his hair as he rolled off her body. "What? You have to be the one to open the door." "I am not doing that," she said, embarrassed at the thought of meeting whoever Neil's visitors were in her state. "You want them to see me like this?" He glanced down meaningfully at the huge bulge in his trousers and then at her in amusement. "Are you sure?" "On second thought," she said, blushing gorgeously as she wore back her gown, "you'd better go to the restroom while I answer the door." Then she headed for the door while he headed to the restroom. She quickly arranged her hair and made sure she looked presentable before opening the door and receiving the shock and embarrassment of her life by the people outside. Chapter 207 My Wife. Outside the door stood Liam and a little girl who was holding his shirt with a teddy bear clutched in her hands as she stared at Mia with a smile. Then there was James, who was carrying countless boxes of gifts that mounted up to his face and covered his vision to the entrance where Mia was looking at them with widened eyes. And then there was Dr. Lauren, and Rain, who looked to be avoiding Liam by standing behind the doctor, who was glaring annoyingly at Zephyr because he'd kept them standing outside for so long. Neil, did you instruct Zephyr to stop us from entering? This big dude almost knocked us all out. James complained the moment he heard the entrance door open, thinking it was Neil who'd opened the door. Mia quickly snapped out of her momentarily shocked state and stepped aside for them to enter the room, wishing she had a mirror to look at her reflection to see if she looked presentable from how Liam was giving her a knowing look. If her appearance didn't give away what they had been doing behind the closed doors of the hospital room, the bed did. 2 pillows were lying on the floor with the bedsheets wrinkled, along with her hospital cap that had been flung away to the top of the headboard. A deep blush crept its way to her cheeks as she quickly attempted to pick up the pillows, avoiding the gazes and awkward throat clearings from the people standing in the room. At this point, she wished the ground would open up and swallow her. Damn it, it was all Neil's fault. As she searched for something to distract everyone, Neil walked out of the restroom looking as if he hadn't been the one to put her in such an awkward state. Noticing Mia's embarrassed state, Neil winked at her before turning his gaze to his so-called visitors. "Why didn't you call to inform me you were coming?" He directed the question to James, who was still holding the gift boxes they'd specially brought for Mia, along with Liam's niece, who was excited about meeting Mia Harrison in person. "We called you, but you didn't pick up," James said defensively as he moved to set down the boxes. When he was about to confirm with Neil if he had indeed told his bodyguards not to allow them entry, his gaze fell on the blonde woman in a doctor's coat, and his breath caught short in his throat. His heart skipped a beat as he was met with the most mesmerizing deep blue eyes gazing at him in annoyance. With the white coat and fair skin, she looked like an angel who'd fallen right from his dreams. Everything blurred away in the room as he stared at her, but she rolled her eyes at him as if used to being stared at and focused her attention on her patient. After checking on how Mia was doing, she excused herself from the visitors. When she walked past him, bumping his shoulder, James felt like he would faint from the excitement rushing through his veins. His gaze followed her until she disappeared out of the room, and Liam nudged him in the side. "Snap out of it, man," Liam remarked, breaking him out of his momentary spellbound state. "You're not her type." James turned to glare at Liam. "And how do you know that when she didn't open her mouth to tell you?" "I know from her expression. Don't even stress yourself by going after her. Doctors are a hard nut to crack." James began to argue, but Neil's slightly irritated voice cut him off. "You are in a hospital room, for goodness sake. Save your argument for later." He helped Mia back to the bed and pulled the blanket to cover her up. She glared at him accusingly, and he couldn't help but smile down at her. To make her feel less embarrassed and awkward, Neil turned to the little girl beside Liam, who had been glancing at Mia and then at Rain, who stood at the side with a guilty expression. Neil didn't acknowledge Rain's presence as he was still damned mad at her for not doing anything to stop Mia's humiliation that night. He didn't care what her reasons were, she'd have to pay the price for it as well. Neil beckoned for Lily to come forward, trying to put on a friendly smile so as not to frighten the girl. However, he had forgotten that Lily Thompson wasn't like the other little girls, as Liam had told him. She didn't care how unapproachable he looked. She grabbed a gift box from the boxes James had brought in and hurried towards Mia's bed. "Aunt Mia, I brought you a wonderful present," she remarked excitedly, her doll-like ebony eyes shimmering with the joy of finally meeting two of her favorite people in person. But then, as if realizing something, she asked, is it okay if I call you Aunt Mia? Some people don't like me referring to them as Auntie, even though they are way older than I am, just like Miss Linda. She scolded me yesterday for calling her aunt. Miss Linda is so mean. She doesn't even know how to cook or tell a bedtime. Lily, Liam sternly interjected before she could go on and on, saying things that weren't meant to be said outside. She was a talkative girl with the mouth of a parrot, and adorable at the same time. "You came here to give Mia your present, and didn't you promise not to talk too much at the hospital?" Lily pouted disappointedly at her uncle's scolding. Then she dejectedly and obediently handed out the box to Mia and muttered, "Get well soon, Aunt Mia." Seeing the little girl's dejected look, Mia sat up and cupped her plump cheeks. Even though she had no idea how the adorable girl was related to Liam, she tried to lift up her spirit. "Do you want to sit beside me and tell me more about yourself, Lily?" Her black, huge eyes brightened up and she immediately nodded her head. Before Liam could say anything to stop his niece from getting on the bed, she jumped on it and made herself comfortable while sticking out her tongue at him. Thanks to Lily, the awkwardness in the room dissipated as she brought laughter with her presence. Everyone, including Neil, who wasn't particularly fond of children, found themselves laughing as the little girl entertained Mia with stories about Liam's female acquaintances, particularly Miss Linda Tudor, who was rumored to be Liam's most recent girlfriend. Each person in the room took turns handing Mia gifts and expressing well wishes for her speedy recovery. However, Rain, still burdened by guilt and shame, lingered on the sidelines, seemingly waiting for the others to leave before approaching Mia. After exchanging words with Liam and James, Mia observed Liam walking over to Neil, who had been seated on the sofa watching her with undivided attention as she laughed at Lily's stories. Neil's affection for Mia was evident as he gazed at her with adoration, seemingly considering her the center of his world. His focus was solely on her, and from the intensity of his gaze, she could tell that he wished they were alone in that moment. However, Liam positioned himself in front of Neil, obstructing Mia's view of him. Neil gritted his teeth in annoyance as his view of his woman was blocked. He glared up at his friend and wished it were someone else so he could punch the living hell out of them for not just interrupting their lovemaking but now blocking his view. He'd had to use every ounce of self-control in him to keep from sending everyone away and having Mia to himself, but then he knew Mia also needed a few distractions after all the things she'd gone through for the past few weeks. I can see that look of annoyance on your face," Liam remarked, shoving his hands inside his pocket and taking a casual stance that made him look more like a $1 million model than the CEO he was. "We need to speak in private, Neil. Can you arrange for a room here or shall we take our discussion to my car?" Neil was about to respond, but at that moment he heard Mia coughing. Jerking up from the sofa, he reached her bedside in seconds. "What's wrong?" he asked, concerned, handing her a glass of water. She shook her head and managed to say, "I'm fine, I choked on my saliva." "I think it's time for everyone to leave. You need all the rest," he said, turning to Liam to add, "I can't leave my wife for now. We will talk on the phone later." All heads turned to Neil at the same time, not because of the fact that he was sending them all away, but because of his claim of calling Mia his wife when he'd not placed a ring on her finger yet. Their relationship hadn't even been known to the public yet, but it seemed he was already making a claim on her. While Mia's heart fluttered with warmth at his words, she couldn't help but feel unsettled by his assumption of their relationship status, especially since he had not even asked her out on a proper date. Despite her deep feelings for Neil and her desire to spend her life with him, Mia also longed to be courted in a traditional manner before discussing marriage. She yearned for romantic gestures like receiving flowers, strolling hand in hand through the city streets at night, going on memorable dates, and creating cherished memories together. However, it appeared that Neil, her impulsive and passionate lover, was eager to skip these steps and leap straight into marriage without even presenting her with a ring. Noticing the disagreeing look in her eyes, a frown settled between Neil's eyebrows. Didn't she want to marry him? Wasn't that the next step of their relationship now that they'd be having a baby? He'd thought about everything when he was away in Verdantia, and his last conclusion had been for them to get married after he'd made his identity as Xavier Galvera known to the world. But seeing the look in her expressive eyes, he knew she was against that. But why? Could it be that she no longer wanted to marry him? Well, for as much as I'd like to let you stay with your wife, what I have to discuss with you is important, Liam said, silently shaking his head in amusement for his friend's lack of understanding of women. From the look in Mia's eyes, he could tell she didn't want to rush their relationship to marriage yet, but his friend was as eager as a puppy to make her his forever. We really need to talk business right now, Neil. Neil was about to protest again, but Mia reached out and grabbed his wrist. Don't worry about me, I have Rain here to keep me company in your absence, she assured, but then regretted saying that immediately as Neil's gray eyes shot daggers towards Rain, who was trying to hide as much as possible from him. I don't trust her enough to leave her here with you, he blurted out coldly, not caring if he'd hurt her feelings. She'd become his enemy the day she watched his Mia suffer. And if he was going to leave this room, Rain would have to leave as well. Neil, she's my friend. You are intimidating her with your look, Mia said in displeasure as she noticed tears of remorse welled up in Rain's eyes. She didn't like how Neil was looking at her like he'd strangle her if he were given the chance. He looked away from Rain only when he heard the displeasure in Mia's voice. I don't trust her and I don't want her here. But I want her here, Mia exclaimed in anger, not liking the fact that he was trying to make decisions for her on who to keep close. She'd hated Owen for that habit and she wasn't going to allow Neil to do that to her as well. She loved him, but he had to let some of his controlling habits go. You can go do your work. Rain will stay with me, Mia decided, looking away from him. Neil's hands balled into tight fists. He glared at Rain, then at Mia, who was looking away from him, and his anger mounted up. Veins throbbed on his forehead, and without another word to Mia, he turned on his heels and left the room. The door banged behind him, making the people in the room jump. After he left, the room fell into an awkward silence. It was Liam who first broke the silence by clearing his throat. Mia, would you mind if I let Lily stay here while I discuss some things with Neil outside? He asked. Mia was quick to nod, swallowing past the remorse that rose up her throat after Neil left the room in anger. Sure, she can stay with me. Right, Lily? She asked the girl with a smile, and Lily eagerly nodded her head, right. Before Liam left with James to go after Neil, he warned his niece to be less talkative and obedient to Mia. Then, glancing at the red-haired woman at the side, he left the room along with James. Chapter 208 Angry. After Liam and James left the room, Mia stared at the door, wishing she hadn't raised her voice at Neil. She didn't like the fact that he'd walked out of the room in anger, nor did she like that he was taking Rain as an enemy. Rain was her only loyal best friend since university, and she didn't want anything to ever come between them, not even the banquet incident. Noticing the look of longing in Mia's expressive eyes as she stared at the door, Rain walked towards the bed and said, I'm sorry for being the cause of your argument, and I'm sorry for not being able to do anything at the banquet. It was not your fault, Rain, Mia cut her off softly. I saw what happened. Your brother and Max were holding you back. I held no grudge against you, and I hope you stop looking remorseful and guilty, she assured with a smile, meaning every single word she said. She'd not blamed Rain for anything that had happened that night, and if she were to hate someone for not interfering, it would be Max and Jason who'd held her back. And she was somehow thankful they'd held her back. If they hadn't, she'd have ruined Rain's reputation as well. Really? Rain's relief shone through tears and a smile, and upon Mia nodding and opening her arms, Rain embraced her, shedding tears of both joy and relief. Thank you. I was scared you would never forgive me, she expressed, then inquired, what about Neil? Don't worry, I'll make him come around. I'll make him understand, Mia assured, stroking Rain's back. After the heartfelt moment, Rain handed her present to Mia. And then, they began to talk like nothing had happened. Lily, who had left the bed and had not spoken a word as the two women were getting along, returned to the bed after she felt it was all right. She sat cross-legged on the bed, but this time, her attention was on Rain. "Can I touch your hair, Miss Rain?" she asked, already reaching out to touch Rain's red hair before she could say yes. Rain laughed when her little hand curiously touched the strands of her hair and let them slide through her fingers. Her expression was like that of an adorable, curious kitten, and Rain couldn't help but reach out to stroke her plump cheeks. "I wish I had your hair, Miss Rain," she whispered in awe. "It's beautiful and soft, and smooth, and so red. I love it so much." Rain exchanged a smiling look with Mia and then said, "Thanks. You don't look bad yourself, Lily. You are the most adorable kid I've seen in ages." She watched the girl smile in delight at her compliment, and Rain's spirits soared even higher. She couldn't help but wonder how such an adorable kid could be related to that Casanova jerk known as Liam Thompson. "I've always wanted to meet you in person to tell you something, Miss Rain. And I'm so glad I met you here. Uncle Liam didn't want to bring me along at first, and I had to cry to Uncle James before he brought me here," she said, adjusting her sitting position on the bed so she could face Rain when she talked. "What is it you want to tell me, Lily?" Rain smiled, unable to get enough of the girl's cuteness and her manner of speaking. Lily sighed heavily like an adult having so much burden on their shoulders. Then, taking Rain's hands into her little ones, she said, "Weeks ago, I showed Uncle Liam a photo of you and I asked him to marry you instead of Miss Linda the Ghostface." She began, causing Rain's eyes to widen in disbelief. "He promised to make you the madam of his house if I don't bother him with a bedtime story anymore, and I believed him and announced it to my friends at school that my favorite character, Merida, is going to marry my uncle and be my aunt. Nobody believed me and laughed at me, and when I told Miss Linda about this the other day, she scolded me and said my uncle will only marry her, and if I ever mention you to my uncle again, she'll make sure I return to my stepfather's house." Rain exchanged looks with Mia, not knowing whether to feel honored that the girl wanted her to marry her uncle or feel terrible at the fact that she'd break her little bubbles by telling her the truth. Liam must be out of his mind to lie to his niece, and he was most certainly insane to believe for a second that she'd spare him a look or consider to be another one of his playthings, like that senseless Linda Tudor who had no brain whatsoever to see that Liam Thompson was just using her. Lily continued, "I don't like Miss Linda and I made that clear to Uncle Liam. I want you and I like you for my uncle. You know why?" she said, beaming from ear to ear, and when Rain shook her head, Lily said, "Because I saw a photo of someone like you in my uncle's drawer when I was looking for a glue to fix the eyes of my favorite doll. The lady has red hair and braces, but she looks so much like you. And along with the photo, I saw a love letter to my uncle. Since he somehow lost that lady who looks like you, I want you to replace her." Rain felt her heart skip a little bit as realization dawned on her. Red hair and braces, that was her teenage self. And a love letter, that must be one of the many ones she'd sent to him in the past. However, remembering all the rumors about him and how he'd once called her ugly as a teenager, she gritted her teeth in annoyance at the fact that he was misleading his little niece and lying to her. And she made a mental note to make certain she set him straight on some few things if they were to meet again. In one of the VIP rooms at City Hospital, Neil had paid for a few minutes to meet with Liam and James. The atmosphere in the room was tense, heavy with Neil's silent anger. He was furious that Mia had chosen to support her deceitful friend instead of understanding his concerns about the company she kept. In his rage, he had confronted a hospital staff member who was gossiping about Mia and speculating about her pregnancy and the rumors surrounding her. Neil's rage had led him to act automatically, ensuring that the man would never speak ill of Mia again. And now, Neil was still seething over the fact that Rain Wallace was currently with Mia. He had never liked Rain due to her brother, and now she had given him even more reason to despise her. He couldn't shake the thought that Rain might be working with Jason to harm Mia. He didn't trust any of those siblings. "What about the OSG company?" Neil asked, momentarily putting his worries aside to focus on the business at hand. "We have gotten many investors back to the Galvera enterprise, we've even had to turn down a lot more," James said after a long silence that followed Neil's question about the OSG company. "Very soon the OSG will file for bankruptcy with how much their stocks and investors are falling. All that will be left is for you to show your face to the world as Xavier Galvera. Many people are curious about the mysterious CEO who's slowly rising back to power after 5 years of setbacks." Neil heard that and a little of his rage began to fade. He wanted nothing more than to put Owen Sullivan back in his place. And no other way would be best than to make him go bankrupt. Neil's dramatic escape from prison, his subsequent release, and now the world wanting to please him in every way possible had combined to make him into an even bigger legend than he'd been before he went to prison. He didn't need to watch the news to know he was now the hottest topic in the world, thus the moment he revealed his identity as Xavier, everything will fall into place. And now, beyond attending to his work and making sure everyone who had wronged him and Mia paid, the only other problem he'd needed to handle personally was the issue of Mia's public image. Originally, when she had stood up for him in the press conference, she had been regarded by the world as a heroine who'd stood up for her past lover, but a few weeks later when fake videos of her began to trend online, she had been regarded as a treacherous bitch who'd betrayed not just him but that bastard, Owen Sullivan. Neil planned to make everything right in the banquet he planned to host to reveal his identity as Xavier Galvera in a week. After that, if he were to hear a word of rumors about Mia, then they'd see the full force of his rage. I want the invitation to be sent to everyone, including Owen Sullivan. What about our investigation on Kelvin Rodrigo's past life and family? Any update? He asked James. Our investigators are still trying their best to dig deeper into his background. We haven't found anything important that's worth your time. All we know is that his only daughter, who has been away to who knows where, has returned weeks ago. His daughter? Neil looked taken aback, as he'd not heard of anything about that cunning man having a daughter or a wife. Yes, though our investigators are unable to take a proper look at her face or get any useful information about her. All we know is that she seemed to be wearing a mask wherever she goes, and it made us believe that she must be hiding some scars or something. James said, handing a few photos to Neil. Those are the photos of her taken from a distance, and in all of them she's seen wearing a mask. Neil only glanced at the photo once and dropped them on the table as they were unimportant to him when the lady's face was masked. Keep investigating about Kelvin. If you can, I'd like to see the photos of his wife, alive or dead. He needed to confirm something before he'd take his final actions on Kelvin. He knew Ella's face, and if she were his wife, then everything would fall into place. Have you heard the news about your uncle? Liam, who'd been silent the whole time, finally spoke. General David has left the country the day your release was announced on the news. I guess the old man is indeed terrified, he chuckled. Neil's handsome features hardened. Good for him, was all he said. But deep down he wished the man had the balls to stay so Neil could unleash all his anger from all the years of pain and misery he'd endured in his hands. Chapter 209 The Daughter of His Enemy. Putting the news about his uncle aside, Neil decided to focus on the more important matters at hand. I want all the media companies who'd published those lies about Mia brought down, Neil said to James, every single one of them, including the Talkwave Productions where she worked before. After Neil finished giving out his final orders on what needed to be done, he couldn't wait to return back to Mia and sort out their unnecessary argument about Rain Wallace. He hated to be the reason her mood got ruined right on the day she'd just regained consciousness. With the current little complications of her pregnancy, Neil wouldn't want to add to her mental health issues with his temperament. She needed all the love and care from him instead of his anger, and storming out of her room in rage was definitely not the way he should go about caring for her. With those thoughts and with everything already being said, he stood up and prepared to leave, but Liam stopped him by saying, I'd like to talk to you in private, Neil. He said, James, please take Lily back with you and drop her at home. I have a few things to discuss with Neil. James didn't argue and nodded in acknowledgement, and he left the room to give the two space. After the door closed behind him, Liam's expression turned serious. Do you remember the investigation you asked my men to do on Elizabeth Harrison's background before you were sent to prison? He said, shoving his hand into his pocket and retrieving a folded envelope. Well, they finally got something about the deceased woman. Neil had almost forgotten about that after all his years in prison. And now that the topic was back, his curiosity was piqued as he took the envelope from Liam to see what was inside. Opening the envelope and taking out the content inside, Neil's hands stilled. How could this be possible? He wondered, holding up a photograph he'd taken out of the envelope. It was a photo of a woman he recognized in the past. That's Elizabeth Harrison, Liam informed upon noticing his friend's dumbstruck expression. Are you sure this is Elizabeth Harrison's photo? Neil asked, staring at the photograph in disbelief. He recognized the woman so well because she was the only person who'd always come looking for Mia whenever she was at their estate. He'd not known her as Mia's mother but her nanny. And his little friend had made sure to always call her by the name Nanny Eliza, not mother. So how come she was her mother now? Yep, I am sure. We even dug into her background, which had been challenging because someone had buried everything away. She once worked as a nanny at a residence in Mirage Mesa, though the family's name has been wiped away, but you wouldn't believe what we found. Take a look at the other photograph in the envelope, Liam said, eager to share this unexpected revelation with his friend. Neil quickly picked up the other photograph that had been lying face down on the table. Turning it around and seeing the people in it, his heart momentarily ceased beating, and his breath caught short in his lungs in dread and disbelief. His hands shook as he stared down at the 4 people in the photograph, one of whom was none other than Kelvin Rodrigo, followed by the nanny holding the younger Mia between her parted legs. Then, no way, Neil thought, refusing to believe what he was seeing in the photograph. Ella, the woman he'd sworn to kill as a boy, was standing beside Kelvin Rodrigo and the nanny. His hands automatically tightened around the photograph until his knuckles turned white, and his gray eyes darkened. Ella was Mia's real mother, which also made it clear that Kelvin Rodrigo was her father, and the man who'd deprived him of a home and parents, who'd taken the life of his precious mother and killed his father. Looking at Ella's smiling face in the photograph only reminded him of all the hate he'd tried to bury away in his heart. It reminded him of all the nights he'd spent in the streets of Mirage Mesa begging for food, all the days of punishment he'd endured at his uncle's hands, all because of Ella and Kelvin Rodrigo. All the rage and hate he'd tried to forget came back like a flood of boiling blood in his veins, turning his breath labored. In Neil's shaking hands, the photograph trembled, a physical sign of the emotional tempest raging within him. Ella's smile in the photograph mocked him, a twisted reminder of his past torment. The memories flooded back, overwhelming him with a potent mix of anger, sorrow, and betrayal. Each line etched on Ella's face felt like a scar on his soul, a testament to the pain she had caused not just him but his family. A humorless laughter escaped his lips as he ran his fingers through his hair. "You're telling me that this son of a bitch and that little bitch are the real parents of the woman I love?" he asked Liam, unable to believe this information and refusing to accept the possibility of it being the truth. How could such cruel people be the parents of his generous, loving Mia? And then it hit him. 5 years ago, after Mia had fallen unconscious on the stage of Ivy Grove and was admitted to a hospital, he'd requested the doctors there to conduct some scans on her to understand why some of her memories were lost. They had performed an fMRI on her. An fMRI scan could detect abnormalities in brain function by measuring blood flow and activity levels in different regions of the brain. Despite the challenge of her being unconscious, they had successfully completed the scan. Back then, Neil had been desperate and curious to know why Mia didn't recall their childhood, leading him to make her undergo the scan without her knowledge. The scan results revealed irregular patterns of brain activity and in areas of her brain showing signs of manipulation and tampering. It came as a shock to the doctor, an old acquaintance of Neil's. The doctor had explained that with such abnormalities, Mia's brain might function differently, causing her memory lapses. In such cases, she might dream and get triggered by little things of the past, but she'd never completely remember anything as the moment they come back to her, they'd disappear again if she were to sleep, the doctor had told him. This is unusual and abnormal. It's not a natural occurrence but something that has been done to her. Nothing made sense to Neil at the time, unable to fathom who could have done such a thing to Mia. He kept it from her, fearing it might complicate things for her if he told her, and instead enlisted Liam's help to investigate Elizabeth Harrison's background. However, with his own legal troubles and subsequent imprisonment, he let go of everything, until now. Now, knowing Mia's connection to Kelvin Rodrigo and Ella, Neil was at a loss. He didn't know what to do or what to believe anymore. The revelation shook him to his core, reopening wounds he had long tried to forget. Did Kelvin Rodrigo do that to her memories? But why, if she was really his daughter? He recalled all the times Mia would come crying to him about her father hitting her mother. He should have known then that she was the daughter of the abusive man responsible for his misery. And despite the revelation that Mia could be Kelvin's daughter, Neil's heart refused to accept the possibility fully. He couldn't reconcile the idea of loving Mia with the knowledge that she might be connected to the man who had caused him so much pain. Deep down, Neil knew Kelvin Rodrigo was likely Mia's real father and the perpetrator of his parents' murder. However, his love for Mia clouded his judgment, preventing him from connecting the final dots that would lead to the truth. He cherished her too much to entertain the idea of losing her or loving her any less. He couldn't imagine a life without her in it now that he knew the joy of having a woman he loved in his arms all day. Before Mia came into his life, Neil had felt like an empty shell, driven solely by a thirst for revenge. But now, with the prospect of a future and a home with Mia and their child, that emptiness seemed to dissipate. However, the looming threat of losing it all and returning to his former miserable self cast a shadow over his newfound happiness. As memories of his mother's warmth and the horror of her death at the hands of Kelvin's men flooded back to his mind, Neil was consumed by a mixture of numbness and hate. The warmth he had felt moments ago was replaced by a suffocating gray fog, enveloping his soul in despair. The truth about everything threatened to unravel the fragile semblance of happiness he had finally found. Liam, who sat opposite Neil, observed the despair etched on his face, his concern evident in his voice as he asked, "What do you plan to do now?" Neil's gaze turned distant as he grappled with the weight of his dilemma. "I have two choices," he replied, his voice devoid of its usual vitality. "Either I continue with Mia and ignore the fact that she's the daughter of the very people I once swore to destroy, or I end our relationship and compel her to undergo an abortion, living with the knowledge that she's not my lover but my enemy." A cruel smile flickered across his lips as he met Liam's gaze. "But you know me, Liam. Forgiveness isn't in my nature, especially not for this. To move on and pretend ignorance would be a betrayal to my mother's memory, and that, I cannot do." Chapter 210 End their relationship. 5 hours passed, and yet Neil didn't return to the VVIP room Mia was staying in. After James had dropped by and picked up the already sleeping Lily, who'd fallen asleep watching cartoons on Rain's phone, Mia had thought Neil would not take long to return to her as it was obvious their meeting was over. But then, even after Rain left 2 hours ago, she was still left on her own in the room with no signs of Neil. Dr. Lauren had dropped by to check up on her and see how she was doing, and after the checkup, she'd said Mia could be discharged in 2 days from now as they needed to monitor her health in the hospital. If it were up to Mia, she'd have liked to be discharged today. She wasn't a fan of hospitals. Even in her childhood, whenever she'd fall sick, her mom would make sure she got treated at home by a nurse due to how hospitals always seemed to affect her mentally. She hadn't been affected when she was surrounded by people hours ago, especially when Neil had been here with her right from the moment she'd woken up. But now that she was lying alone on the bed with nothing to do but stare at the muted television in the room, she felt suffocated and uneasy. The sun had dipped behind the horizon 3 hours ago and the sky was already darkened through the glass walls. She could see the city lights from her lying position, but that wasn't enough to distract her mind from the uneasiness and fear for no absolute reason. Mia's fingers clenched around her sheets as the silence and the familiar smell of the hospital made her feel like she was enclosed in a tight space with no breathing room. She wished desperately that Neil was here with her, and she hoped he would take her home tonight. However, she didn't see him, not even to talk him into taking her away from this suffocating place. The longer time ticked by with no signs of Neil, the more anxious and worried she became. Was he still mad that she'd supported Rain over him? What if he didn't come to her tonight because of his anger? Despair and fear began to settle in her heart. She quickly sat up and looked around for her phone, but it was nowhere in sight. Not even her bag was there. Then she remembered she hadn't taken her bag to the cliff where she'd fallen unconscious and been brought to the hospital. Pulling away the blanket around her body, Mia hurried to climb down from the bed, but her haste caused a flood of dizziness to wash over her, almost making her lose her balance. Stabilizing herself, Mia walked to the door and pulled it open. Outside, the hallway was quiet and empty, mirroring the stillness within her room. Even the bodyguards assigned by Neil had left. Mia's uneasiness grew as she wondered where they had gone. She remembered Neil telling Zephyr not to leave her door unguarded when he left with Liam and James, yet there was no one here now. As she contemplated whether to stroll around the hospital to pass the time until Neil returned, which she prayed and hoped he would, she heard the loud clapping sounds of thunder that startled her. She automatically backed away into the room and slammed the door shut before running back towards the bed as if the hounds of hell were chasing her. Her hands were shaking, and her heart was throbbing against her ribs as she watched the gloomy clouds gather outside the glass, with lightning flashing in the sky. The first rain of the season, Mia realized in dread as she stared at the glass wall, trembling and praying someone would walk in before it started raining. She'd never liked rains and thunder. They were her worst fear and worst nightmare. Even as an adult woman, she'd always been terrified of them and would hide in a place where she couldn't hear the sounds or see the slight reflection of lightning. For the past 5 years, she'd known how to navigate the rain all the time. Sometimes she made sure to be around people or wear loud earpods and close all her curtains. Sometimes she'd even ask to stay with Owen, even though she didn't like it, and would request to lay on his bed and sleep beside him. However, now she had no earpods and nobody to lay next to her. She clenched the sheet to her chest and pulled her knees up, muttering prayers for the rain not to start. As the first drop of rain splattered against the glass, Mia's body tensed, her breath catching in her throat. A shiver ran down her spine, and when the thunder rumbled through the sky, she let out a piercing scream, her hands clutching the blanket tightly around her. The memories of her past terrors flooded her mind like a relentless storm, overwhelming her senses. I don't care what happens to her, just cut her open and do your fucking job. I need to deliver those drugs before dusk tomorrow. Yes, sir. In her mind's eye, she saw the men in white, their faces obscured by shadows as they approached her with cold, clinical precision. She begged and pleaded for them to stop, her voice choked with fear, but they held her down mercilessly. The glint of a knife pierced the darkness, sending a wave of panic coursing through her veins as she struggled to get away from them. She called out to her mom to help her, but when she didn't come to her rescue like she always did in the past, she called for the only name that had been carved into her heart ever since the day she confessed to love him. Neil, she cried out, her voice cracking with desperation. Please, help me. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she called out for him, her pleas echoing in the empty room as she trembled like a dying animal. But her animalistic cries went unanswered, lost in the tumult of her own terror. As the rain continued to fall in a relentless downpour, Mia's grip on reality began to slip. Her body trembled uncontrollably, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. She felt like a child lost in the darkness, alone and vulnerable. She cried until her voice turned hoarse and dry, until her tears could no longer fall, and until she felt drained and completely out of her right senses where she could not tear the reality apart from her imagination. Suddenly, the door to the hospital room flew open, and Mia's heart pounded in her chest. She jumped at the unexpected intrusion, her eyes wide with fear. No, please, she whimpered, her voice barely more than a whisper. Don't hurt me, I won't tell anyone what I saw. I promise. But the shadowy figure continued to approach her, and she pleaded while backing away in fear. She shut her eyes when the figure ran to her bedside, but instead of the slap she expected to receive from him, she felt his comforting hand touch her arm. She'd have jumped back and fallen off the bed if she didn't open her eyes instinctively to realize it was not a threat. It was Neil, his gray eyes filled with concern and compassion. Mia, he said softly, reaching out to touch her trembling arm. It's me, you're safe now. I won't hurt you. Mia's breath hitched as she looked up at him, her eyes swimming with tears. Neil, she whispered, her voice trembling with relief. They are going to hurt me again. Don't leave me. He gathered her into his arms, holding her close as she sobbed uncontrollably. I'm here, he murmured, his voice a soothing balm against her fears. I'll always be here for you, my love. Nobody will ever hurt you. Nobody, he whispered, tightening his hold around her trembling body and regretting his foolish decision to consider ending their relationship because of her blood relation to his worst enemy. He'd almost made a decision that could have devastated them both. After Liam had left him alone 4 hours ago, he hadn't been able to face Mia, fearing that seeing her would weaken his resolve for revenge and his decision to end their relationship today. For years, he had lived with one purpose, to destroy the entire family of the man responsible for his misery. Being with Mia would mean betraying the oath he made to his mother to avenge her, and that was something he couldn't do. Without looking back, he'd stormed out of the hospital, no longer considering Mia his concern. He had even gone as far as to order his men to leave her unprotected, believing her damned father would protect her from now on, not him. He'd driven to a nearby bar, seeking solace in wine to numb himself from thoughts of Mia. Today was supposed to mark the end of their relationship and the end of his vulnerability. He had convinced himself of this as he drank at the bar, determined never to be vulnerable again. He was going to burn down Kelvin Rodrigo's entire empire and family until he'd feel the pain of losing everything just like Neil had felt as a boy. He'd been so sure of what he wanted to do that he'd deleted Mia's whole pictures from his gallery and decided to drive to Kelvin's estate to beat the living shit out of his old bones. However, on his way to the Rodrigo residence, he'd stopped at a red light and found himself beside a car carrying a family. A man, his wife, and their little daughter sat inside, radiating joy and warmth. Neil couldn't explain what drew his gaze to them, but he watched as the man played with his daughter, while his wife held her close. They laughed together, their happiness palpable. The little girl, as if sensing Neil's presence, turned towards him and waved her tiny hands, giggling with delight. Neil's heart swelled with an unexplained warmth, and he found himself smiling back at the baby, lost in a moment of unexpected connection. When he snapped out of it, the car had already driven away, leaving him stunned and shaken. As he sat there, his hands tightening around the steering wheel, Neil realized the mistake he was making by breaking up with Mia because of her father, who obviously didn't care for her. He had been so focused on his vendetta against Kelvin Rodrigo that he had failed to see the bigger picture. Seeing the love and happiness in that family's eyes made him question his own choices. If he hadn't discovered Mia's connection to Kelvin, he might have been on the path to becoming a father himself. But more importantly, he realized that Mia was just as much a victim of Kelvin's cruelty as he was. She had suffered greatly at the hands of her own father, traumatized and used as a pawn. He couldn't abandon her now, especially not when he understood the depth of her pain. Hurting her would make him no different from Kelvin Rodrigo, and that was a fate he couldn't bear to accept. As Neil began to give himself reasons not to take the steps he was about to take, lightning flashed in the sky and then the sound of thunder followed, snapping him back to his senses. When the first drop of rain hit his windshield, his heart slammed against his ribs as he recalled how Mia was terrified of rain, and without wasting any time, he'd driven like a madman back to the hospital.